Welcome to The Path to Killing Philosophy, an overview of Beliefonomics. Is this really the book that's going to kill philosophy? Why do we have to kill philosophy? Is this even a book? Why do we have to kill philosophy? Because we have never properly understood the historical meaning of Socrates' death, nor what Socrates said about philosophy in the Apology, his testimony. When we understand what Socrates' philosophy was telling us about human behavior, we can really understand the significance of the Greeks in the history of human behavior. We are going to make some clear statements about how to situate Greek philosophy in relation to so-called Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. This whole picture of what has been called the axial shift in human society by Karl Jaspers, the first millennium BC in world religions, is going to look much more well-defined once we get Socrates' Apology, his explanation of philosophy, correct. Then we step back. Oedipus and his riddle. Oedipus is emblematic of the great crisis in human behavior in Greek societies that Socrates discovered with his philosophy. This was a crisis of ritual. With Beliefonomics' new rereading of Oedipus, we can crystallize how not merely modern philosophy, but all of Western humanities and social sciences have failed so far to grasp this Greek crisis. Call it a crisis, call it a transition. How it laid the background for the modern West, colonialism, Christianity before that, and the ideas and ideologies of the modern world system. When we see it clearly, philosophy is just a relic, dead like Oedipus, a cultural relic from a very important historical transition. The chapters I've just described are really from the middle of a larger project. The off-course texts, it's a series of philosophical reflections on the big here and the long now. It's intellectual history, or big intellectual history, intellectual big history. And you can already listen to book one of the off-course texts on YouTube. It's called Serendipity, Lost, Eden, and Its Consequences. Serendipity Lost laid out the Neolithic transition and the dawn of history, early civilizations. That is the background to the development of Greek society, but a lot of the historical basics that are covered in Serendipity Lost are recapped in mainly chapters 2 and 3 of Beliefonomics. Chapter 1. It's kind of a humorous introduction, it's a hook, but it also introduces the fundamental concepts of the book. We already mentioned the Greek crisis. It was a crisis of ritual, and that crisis, in a sense, is still ongoing. Here we're taking an example from the modern day, writing a non-fiction book, and the behaviors associated with that. How do you start a book? Writers get advice all the time. Writing experts give advice all the time. There are obviously norms in place. And one of those norms, a big norm, perhaps one overriding option, the anecdote. Well, what is this? What is this rule? What is this norm? Is it a ritual? I don't think it is. I think it may be something that's come to be done out of imitation. And I just lay out here that imitation, a norm that has become common out of imitation, that is what we should call convention. So we're going to move on to philosophy. And in chapter 2, what I contend is Socrates began philosophy as a war against convention. What happened with the Apology is that people misunderstood what Socrates was trying to get us to understand. That's not surprising. He was probably nervous. He was on trial and was executed. When we dig deeper, his statements about how he became who he was, the philosopher, it wasn't really about wisdom. People have the idea that this was about wisdom. And whose fault is that? Well, I think it's Plato's, because this was Plato's great anecdote. This was the anecdote that Plato used to begin his philosophical career. And what Plato loved was wisdom. That wasn't necessarily what philosophy was all about. Actually, I don't think it was. What philosophy was about for Socrates, this is the hypothesis, it was about norms in crisis. The decline of ritual and the increase in power, pervasiveness of convention. Again, norms by imitation, no longer norms by belief. And this is the basic idea when he goes around. This is the basic idea of what Socrates describes as his personal journey of philosophy. He goes around asking people why they do what they do. And ultimately, they can't say. When you believe in a ritual, you know why you do it. You could be wrong, you could be deluded, you could be crazy. When it's a convention, you do it because it's what everyone does, or at least what everyone in your community of artists, farmers, craftsmen, politicians, etc., the people who Socrates went to talk to. They do what they do simply because it's imitation. And Socrates had a problem with that. He said, we need to fight against this, and the weapon to be used was dialogue. Now, why didn't that get through? We'll talk more about it in the later chapters where we focus on Plato, but essentially, Plato created Anecdologues. He took the dialogue, the weapon against convention, and he converted it into a literary form where Socrates anchored him in a place, in a historical narrative that he wanted to create. But at its core, philosophical dialogue was a war against conventional behavior, against doing simply what other people or what everyone else did. And instead, it enabled the creation of new standards and principles of behavior. So I think hopefully it's already clear by now. I don't want to kill the idea of dialogue per se. That project, that process seemed to have been important. But what this name of philosophy came to refer to was actually going to be something that should have been called Sophophilia. Love of knowledge should be called Sophophilia. Philosophy was something else. Philosophy was the engagement and knowing through friendship, dialogue, and discussion. But moving on to the next, so in chapter 2, I really look at the Apology closely, go through and stake that claim, that hypothesis about dialogue as philosophy, war against convention. What happened to that? Well, it became an anecdote or an anecdologue, or many anecdologues, for Plato, who was a sophophile. Again, though, this is the key thing. It's why Socrates, why then? Because this was the moment where Socrates looked around and said, I don't see ritual anymore here. So chapters 3 and 4 are going to give the historical context for that discovery of Socrates, that scandalous discovery. So in chapters 3 and 4, we reassess the position of ancient Greek society in history. It was the product of a melting pot in the Mediterranean. Greek society imported religious ideas, gods, myths from, the precursor societies on the Greek peninsula, the Minoans and Mycenaeans, but also from the Middle East and Egypt. And this is going to be important when we look at Oedipus as the emblem of this decline of ritual, this delocalization of great societies. There had been great societies before where ritual was a tool of domination of these hierarchical societies over really the previous 2 millennia, maybe 3. You have societies that were unprecedentedly large. Well, the Greeks were the product of the collapse of those societies. They rose from the rubble. They were a product of a shatter zone. But you can't put the pieces all back together. The rituals were not believed in the same way. There was a marketplace of religions, as other scholars have named it. You don't have the state controlling religion anymore. You have homes, households, and the individuals controlling those households, they are taking the gods that they choose to privilege. So in that society, fundamental idea is that you now have an increasing reliance on convention and imitation rather than authentic belief. This is discovered by Socrates. And so chapters 3 and 4 lay out the proposition. Well, it's actually the non-originality of ancient Greece that made it original. It was the fact that there was competition. It was the fact that ritual was in crisis. That required the invention of philosophy, dialogue, and the war against convention. I do apologize if this is disappointing to some people. And I should add that I agree with many of the insights from the subfields of philosophy and related fields. Obviously, I'm making use of them. And of course, I've been wrong before. I've made a lot of mistakes. I'll continue to make mistakes. I apologize. Chapter 5, we look at, well, what did Plato do about all this? Putting words in Socrates' mouth, making the most of his anecdote, his anchor with his readers or listeners and students, disciples. He wasn't looking to revive ritual. He was looking to create a new way of authorizing authority. Sophophilia, love of knowledge, rule by the wise. And in this chapter, I go through some of the most interesting critical commentators on Plato and also give a sense of how Sophophilia became an ideology, which we're going to define more carefully in the next chapter. It was Plato's ideology, and perhaps Sophophilia was kind of the first ideology. But anyway, in this chapter, we're going to look at some pieces of Plato's dialogues, as well as some critical thinkers like Nietzsche, Karl Popper, more recently Nassim Taleb. Calling Sophophilia an ideology, this fits within the overall framework of norms, a new conceptual framework, or kind of fixing up what we already have. That's what chapter 6 is all about. And I joke that chapter 6 is what you don't want to start your nonfiction book with, because this is going into the conceptual repair, the attempt to repair what we have, which is a lot of ambiguous, sometimes synonymous terminology that refers to human norms. It seems like the Greeks may have been a part of this problem because they really only had one word, nomos. This covered everything. We have a lot of different terms, but a lot of times they get used, I don't want to say interchangeably, but there's too much exchangeability. We need to make distinctions. And I've already, in this video, explained, you have ritual, norms based on shared belief, whether true or false. Belief is a problem in itself. We'll get to that later. Convention, norms propagated by imitation. In chapter 6, we discuss a little bit more deeply the idea of tradition. At least in the context of what we find here. Of course, it may have other meanings elsewhere. Tradition attempts to take conventions and make them appear as rituals or perhaps as standards. And ideology is the rationalization of these traditions, whether new or old traditions. And we can look, and we do look in this chapter, at a few examples from modern times. I mean, the most ideological societies were probably the 20th century communist totalitarian society. And I think it's important that ideology is going to show up as more than simply shared ideas of a group or faction of society. There's something more going on if you historicize norms using the framework that I've been talking about, where you had ritual in ancient, even prehistoric societies, then in ancient great societies, and then in the Greeks you start to see the problems. You start to see the cracks. Tradition and ideology, the cracks that have appeared in belief, where ritual is no longer, or doesn't seem any longer possible in the same way. Ritual seems to be important here. You're probably thinking, well, if the Greeks aren't a good example of that, then how do we have an idea of what that was? Well, Socrates, also the dawn of Christianity, was theorized by Karl Jaspers as part of a shift across, at least Eurasia, in the world system of that time, the axial shift that gave rise to all world religions that we know. And Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, these are included in that shift. And Confucianism and Taoism, especially Confucianism, had a very developed theory of ritual. Socrates was dealing with a society overrun by convention. Confucius was dealing with, how do you preserve ritual as the social bond? How do you preserve authenticity of belief? So this chapter 7, we kind of try to zoom out from the Greek melting pot and the problem of convention fought against by philosophy's dialogue. We zoom out and see a little bit of the Eastern side of things. Maybe there is still something that we can know and understand, love, and use from this idea of ritual. The fact that these classics, Confucius, Lao Tzu, even maybe Buddhism is often, or Zen, is often called Eastern philosophy. Well, I think that needs to stop. We're also going to see the legacy of Socrates' philosophy a lot more clearly. And in this, I really have to admit that the scaffolding for what I've tried to build, really in all of the research that's gone into the off-course text, is Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze. And in Foucault's final year of lectures before he died unexpectedly, the focus was on Cynic philosophy, the Greek performance of virtue that followed after Socrates' death, an alternative trajectory of philosophy to Plato. Also, I should acknowledge that Ezra Pound's translations of Confucius, I started reading this. I picked up a copy in San Francisco after I finished my dissertation in 2012. That was huge. Also Herman Melville's Confidence Man, where cynicism is so written into this demonstration of people's misinterpretations of antiquity. The Confidence Man is a performance, or literary performance, of people's misinterpretations of antiquity. In any case, cynicism, Diogenes the Cynic, these were the performances, the battles against convention that continued Socrates' war against convention. And the sad thing is, these are often dismissively referred to as anecdotes, these stories about Diogenes. They're actually closer to what Zen monks call koans. Not quite the same level of, let's call it, difficulty or obscurity, but they are like judicial cases or speech acts where something is being decided between Diogenes and his interlocutors, like Alexander the Great. And so we talk about some of those in this Socrates Gone Mad, chapter 8. The person who most interestingly compared Oedipus and Christ was René Girard. His talk about scapegoating and imitation. It's about, Greek drama, Oedipus, Sophocles' Oedipus. Oedipus obviously had some historical reality as the foreign king. He was a delocalizer. Christ would become a great delocalizer as Christianity spread, the image of Christ. The Christians wanted their own Oedipus, and they wanted to make use of Oedipus. And we deal with some of the problems, or also what we want to take and leave from Girard, who's constantly increasing in popularity. Buddha was also a delocalizer. And the idea that Oedipus was historical allegory, this is not new. Bernard Knox, the famous classicist, argued as such, but it was about the failures of rationalism. But we're not going down that road exactly. Instead, Oedipus, in the riddle of the Sphinx, what did he do? He killed ritual. He killed the archaic religion. And what was left? Well, we talk about that, and we try to bring out the drama as the drama of the Greek world. The problem faced by philosophy. Was Oedipus the philosopher? This is what Jean-Joseph Gou, extremely interesting French theorist, claimed. Oedipus was the philosopher, also rationalist. Not necessarily, but he is emblematic of this problem in Greece. And then if you look at some of the sequels and related plays by Sophocles and to some extent by others, especially in Aeschylus' Seven Against Thebes, you see this foregrounding of ritual to the point of exaggerated crisis. But in the other plays by Sophocles, you actually see these reflections, or these almost, dare I say, prophecies of the Christian and Islamic legacies and how they are going to play out the decline or the post-decline era of ritual in the West. Well, look, there's so much to be said about Jesus Christ and the Gospels, but here we just try to do enough to get Christ the philosopher into this overall problematic of the war against convention, the Cynic legacy. There's some great literature on Christ as Cynic, or at least comparable to Cynic. What I try to do here is just also put that in this axial context where we are talking about the Eastern recognition of the problem of ritual philosophy in Greece in the context of the decline of ritual, where Christ comes into all that as his own thing and yet also reflecting on many of these problems. Looking forward, the next book in the off-course texts, Beliefonomics is technically book 3. Book 4 is going to be more about the historical Jesus, and then more talk about the historical Paul, the church fathers, and what happens in the next millennium or more. But for now, just for the purposes of this, we're really just setting up a view forward through the Cynics to Christ and the comparison between Christ and the emblem of the Greek crisis of ritual and the empowerment of convention, Oedipus. Where do we go from here? Well, what about so-called philosophy today? What about philosophy's legacy for us? Philosophy is our sphinx. It is this bizarre, mysterious animal, and I am, or maybe the people trying to save philosophy, I don't know, the people who are following Stanley Cavell, or anybody in philosophy departments, who aren't strict historicists. And I think it's important for people to think. And philosophy is a name for that, but I think it's, in a sense, a misnomer. It's a sphinx that's preventing us from getting out of the gates of Thebes, this label of philosophy. And so we need to kill philosophy, as I mentioned earlier. I didn't necessarily believe that we had to kill philosophy when I started working on it, but I don't think we need to kill thought. Remember, Gilles Deleuze, he would sometimes talk about philosophy, of course, but almost more often, history of philosophy or thought and the powers of thought outside of any label of philosophy. And his idea of philosophy was actually kind of a slap in the face. The problem is Sophophilia. There is an ideology of Sophophilia and a pathological love of knowledge. Even the urge to kill dialogue, which was the true philosophy. It's become a sphinx. No, the Greeks didn't know what the sphinx was. They got it from somewhere. It had power, but it was also almost comically mysterious. They couldn't believe it in anymore. Like Paul Vane's idea, did the Greeks believe in their myths? Did the Greeks believe in the Sphinx? Well, not really, but it still had a power. Do we today believe in philosophy? I'm not sure that we do. Does it still have a power, a mystique? And do we need that? Proposing no. What do we need? Chapter 12, I try to lay out some possibilities. Well, it's how do we revisit the legacy of dialogue? And I'm trying to continue the joke from first chapter of if you want to succeed at so on and so forth, this kind of self-help mantra, current social media influencer type shtick. Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Well, what did he say? Pretend to have a dialogue. Pretend to make it a dialogue. That's how you get people interested. And this is not the same thing as starting your book with an anecdote, but it's not unrelated. And I talk about that, but trying to continue the joke here. What is the legacy of dialogue today? Overall, in the off-course texts, I'm kind of trying to draw out, like, what are the ancient legacies of modern ideas of capitalism and democracy? What do those ideals really mean? And how to win philosophy and influence sages. This problem of asking questions. What is a real dialogue? Where is the real dialogue? What do you need for real dialogue? Our society, which has moved, or our world system, that has moved quite far away from what dialogue was in the time of Socrates. Is it just a joke? Or is it just debate? Is it just dog whistling? Is it just signaling? This is kind of what the Dale Carnegie book, to me, means, although he wasn't trying to say that. How to get your way by asking questions. There's other self-help books, and we'll talk about a couple of them in this chapter, that give other reasons for why you want to make a more interactive model for creating standards of behavior, for creating new norms and laws. So that's what we have to come. And I hope you will like, follow, subscribe. I hope you're going to be interested in sharing your thoughts and feedback. I hope you're going to be interested to go ahead to chapter 1. Go back to Serendipity Lost, Eden and its Consequences, for a little of the prehistoric to historic context, the ideas of where archaic civilizations were built from, and then where the Greeks are going to emerge from the rubble. You can also get more of a full idea of the off-course text as a series, to see, you could spend quite a bit of time with us here and start an interesting journey that's going to take us throughout what Brian Eno called the big here, the whole world, and the long now, which is roughly since the dawn of agriculture, the history as we know it, the last 10,000 years. We want your feedback. We want to increase the dialogue. We want to explore the limits of what a dialogue can do through the means available today. We also need your financial support as soon as you can. And you can also use Patreon, Ko-Fi, Dogecoin, or other cryptocurrencies. They're listed below to support us. Reach out and let's move forward on this project. It's been a long time coming.